What is going on, everybody? It is not Thomas Pinzone. It is Sam Lattof here from the Blazing Musket with a nice special episode, mostly because I'm hosting it, but also, too, because we have two great guests, and Matt Entriken from Raising Anchor and Oliver Scholes, the beat writer for Hartford Athletic for the Blazing Musket. We're here to talk about the CBA negotiations between the USL and USLPA. The season has now come to an end. Now the question is, will a deal be made? Could we potentially be headed to a lockout? So a lot to talk about. The history of the CBA, the USLPA, plenty to talk about. I am not qualified to talk about it. These two guys are, so make sure to give them a follow. Matt does a great job with the Raising Anchor podcast, as well as Jason. Oliver, his writing is amazing. So make sure to check these guys out. But just want to start off, guys, how are we doing on this Tuesday before Thanksgiving?
I'm okay. Thanksgiving's not a huge holiday for me. I'm an immigrant. I come from an immigrant family in England where my parents grew up and were raised. Thanksgiving, not a huge deal. So I'm just looking forward to a relaxing day off. And maybe some good news about a CBA, but I'm not hopeful.
I mean, as an immigrant, I would think Thanksgiving is kind of anti, what you've wanted, because it's one of those days where we're like, hey, we kind of separated from that group and then almost all died. But thankfully, the Native Americans came in and took care of us. And then, we repaid them in kind. So it's a lovely holiday, Sam. And I'm so glad that we could be talking about the spirit of community, because that's really what the USLPA, the CBA, and the ongoing relationship with the USL has all been about. So if I'm thankful for anything besides the dinner that I'm going to have with friends and family, it's the fact that I get to talk to you two lovely people here on this wonderful Tuesday night.
Well, I really appreciate that, Matt. Really do appreciate that. Yes, I was talking with Oliver too. Turkey, very overrated. So not my preferred meat to consume. So kind of there with Oliver as well. But obviously great to see the friends and family. But let's kind of get into similar to the history of that lovely holiday. Let's get into the history of the USLPA and kind of its collective bargaining agreements. It definitely seemed like it's come a long way. So Oliver, just how has the USLPA kind of progressed being able to leverage itself and kind of really fight for players' rights?
Well, this is kind of new ground the last 4 or 5 seasons, right, for this tier of soccer in America. You go back to 2020 and before, there wasn't a backstop other than, the minimum it took to get players on your roster, right? The bare minimum that you had to do. There were no minimum salaries. There were obviously no guarantees. It felt like every season you would hear stories from one team or another. The team had agreed to pay a per diem and then it was taking it back, or the showers didn't work, or they were, going on a bus, or they were changing in a shipping container before games, or whatever it might be, right? And not just for USL, right? That was true in basically every non-MLS soccer league in America of any description. And then the first CBA comes in, it's agreed in, I think, October of 2021. It takes effect for the 2022 season. And this is a huge step. It's a huge step of the players organizing, of the players being disciplined and standing together, right? To say there need to be these minimums. There needs to be some kind of threshold. We cannot continue in these situations where if you play for Louisville, it's great and you've got a dedicated film room. And if you play for, Hartford, let's say, there's no training facility at all. Right, you're training on training fields that you've borrowed from somebody else, or you're training at the stadium, right? Because there's literally nothing else. It can't be the case that one team is paying, $80,000 or $100,000 contracts, and another team is saying, well, some guys are going to make some money and other guys are going to play for free, right? Play for exposure, essentially, which was what was happening. So the first CBA set some very minimum thresholds. It sets a minimum compensation threshold of $2,600 a month that can include a housing subsidy, or it can include an in-kind for housing. It can include health insurance if that's being paid for the player, up to a certain threshold. I think 50% of it has to be actual salary. So it's a minimum of $1,300 a month of actual salary, which, if you're doing the math across a 10-month contract, is not actually very much money. So it's this very low bar, but it is a bar, right? It's above where we were 21, 2020, 2019, and before. And it sets some other things too, right? It creates an expectation that players are able to participate in workers' compensation, right? That they're going to be insured in that way by the clubs. It creates some expectations about per diems and travel. And they're very, very basic expectations. Like, let's not get carried away. And that collective bargaining agreement runs through December 31st, 2025 at midnight. So we're kind of bearing down on that right now. And that's kind of the history of at least that part of the CBA.
Yeah, Matt, and just kind of like Oliver mentioned, a lot of these seem to be kind of basic ask, especially, coming from workers. Overall, building off of that CBA, what is the USLPA kind of looking to ensure in terms of, players' rights, whether it's payment, health insurances? Are some of these asks? And I guess also too, just what have the efforts been like to negotiate and just sit down with the USL to try and make a deal?
Yeah, so first and foremost, there's multiple different things that they want to accomplish in this next edition of the CBA. Primarily, if you had to put them under pillars, it's really an understanding of an increase in minimum salary expectations. I've heard that the minimum they'd like to target is 40,000 per player, and again, that takes into account some of the mechanics around housing, health benefits, and et cetera. Again, thinking if you look at the current CBA's construction around that, 26,000 10-month contract with half of it having to be there, that's only 13,000. So if the minimum floor that they're trying to elevate to is about 40,000, you're talking an additional $7,000 minimum payout increase per player per year. But I've also heard that they want to try to target this a little bit higher, up to as high as 60 to 70,000. You think back, and I know we try not to compare apples to oranges on these shows, but you look at the MLS in that same time span, 9 years into the MLS's shelf life, if you will, those minimum contracts were sub 60,000 as well. You had college players coming straight out of Division I schools and joining the only Division I standard when it came to soccer in America. So I don't think that that's really a far leap, but at the same time, these are club owners that aren't piled together in a single entity system. So, that could have a financial strain, but there's discussions going there. So it's the minimum salary threshold for players. The second piece, and probably the most important one that I've heard consistently from players, from reps, and from the USLPA itself, is that mandatory health benefits package. Today, again, without single entity, each club is responsible and it's in a voluntary state on whether or not they want to elect in for players to support them from a compensation package when it comes to health benefits, workers' comp for player injuries, and all of those different things. Some clubs, according to the USLPA, do it really well. We've been told, just again, because we cover Rhode Island. Rhode Island's one of those clubs that is kind of setting the level of standard, of professional standard, to where it needs to be. But a lot of clubs are way behind the kind of marker in that sense. So they want one kind of system. Now, what it's been explained to me is that they're not looking, even though they would probably benefit from one single healthcare package. You think about not just the bargaining of the players, but you also think just in terms of the way the concept and structure of insurance works. The more players you have in one overarching umbrella policy, the cheaper your actual costs will be, the more money will go into the pool to kind of float those expenses, and the better off everyone will be, whether that's a partnership with all of the clubs or that's sponsored through like USL HQ. But that's not necessarily the point where they'll say, hey, it doesn't need to be one healthcare system. If each club wants to elect their own pay-as-they-go health benefits management position, that's fine, but every club needs to come to the table with one of those ready to provide to their players. So that's the second pillar. And then the third is just player protections on contract expectations. We're talking, unfortunately, North Carolina FC is now ceasing operations, and it was a very big issue because we've seen every year over the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen a USL franchise close its doors, and players are just left out to dry. And, whether they weren't getting a multi-year contract, which a majority of USL players often have not received, the ones that are on contract for that next year, they receive 1/10 of the payout, sometimes 1/5 of that payout, and they're in a bad position because they're thinking that they're going into next year with a secure future. And if you think about it, for the people that don't really know how the mechanics work, if you're a player of quality that could find a spot somewhere in the league, yes, there's a chance you could bounce back, but you're on the backside of those negotiations at that point. Deals start to happen as early as August as agents start having conversations either with their current club or away from those clubs into different leagues. You talk about the window, USL already not in the normal FIFA calendar. That puts players in a big compromise when it comes to the jeopardy of if they'll find playing time at some other club the current or following year, and it puts them on the back burner. So the fact that then, in addition to the fact that they can't find a new contract, then they also aren't getting paid for the contract that they were already promised. So the league is looking, or excuse me, the USLPA is looking for security for those players. Those are the three probably biggest talking points that I've heard the most in speaking with the USLPA, with the reps. But then there are so many other things which we would call the professional standard. Some of the things like Oliver mentioned, we've heard at length this year of players not having suitable conditions around having the right access to amenities and staff when it comes to administration, from locker management, kit management. We've heard that athletic trainers aren't always in the appropriate amount of conditioning when it comes to who is representing. Is it a certified athletic trainer, or is it someone wearing multiple hats that can take care of that? There's been so many instances this year where the league has demonstrated by proxy through their ownership that these standards aren't elevating the game for the players, and yet the players are playing more games, they're playing more minutes, and it doesn't seem to be kind of adjusting or balancing out for the amount of output that they're having with this increase in attendance, with this increase in attraction and attention to the league. So it's nothing unrealistic. And if you look back in the history of other collective bargaining agreements for other sports at this level of infancy, it's not uncommon. And it's kind of a surprise, to Oliver's point, that we're this far in. I know there's been some articles, 25, 30. I think we're now past 40 iterations of the USLPA coming together with USL to have these discussions. And I'm not even saying little progress. I'm going to say no progress has been made whatsoever.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, Matt, these are not crazy ask. I think it would be kind of stunning if, we all walked into, a full-time job and they're like, yep, we're not going to provide you with health insurance, especially when you kind of think about the nature of just playing sports in general, how much you have to take care of your body. There's always, the quote that comes from LeBron James, how he'd always say he has to pay $1 million to keep his body, in right condition, if you will. Obviously, it's not that for USL players, but this is something that, should be something that they receive, especially considering, the sport that they play, the physical toll that they're putting on their bodies. And also, too, we're in an environment where pro rel is on the horizon. To think about, you could be, with a club then all of a sudden announces it's going to be kind of ceasing operations. I believe the USLPA put out a story where, a player found out that his club was not going to, be around anymore. And he was essentially given, I believe, 2 months severance pay to kind of, figure out, what he was going to do. And similar to, like you mentioned, Matt, when you're kind of getting, not that full contract, you're kind of getting, kind of a structured almost like settlement or, portion of your contract. It can really put you on the back foot, not only just, looking for a new deal, but just trying to kind of make ends meet and kind of, figure out what your next step is going to be. I know it's been mentioned by the USLPA too that, for a long time, these guys were having to juggle, multiple jobs and kind of trying to make things work. So it's, like you guys have said, kind of stunning that we've been able to get here. But I think the next point to kind of, jump to is...
Real fast, Sam, real fast. Talked with John Morrissey about that last statement with North Carolina and specifically, and he said that the USLPA were the ones that tipped that North Carolina was going to be ceasing operations. If it had been North Carolina's choice, they would have rug pulled after their exit from the playoffs, wherever that would have been. So when you think about it, they weren't even going to tell fans and their own playing staff that they were going to be folding until even later, if it hadn't been for the courtesy of that first informing the USLPA, because they're not required to do that today. And then when the USLPA found out, they stood up for the players and said, we don't care about your courtesy. We don't care about what you thought would be what you wanted to do. We're informing everyone right now. And the cat got out of the bag sooner than North Carolina wanted ever to let that have happen. So again, another proof of when you do things the wrong way, the players are punished, the fans are punished, the league is punished, and it's not good for our players.
Yeah, and we've heard that before, right? That in this case, North Carolina, the news got out essentially via the USLPA pretty early as these things go, but it's been January sometimes when these things have happened, and those are guys who are really then up against it. To your point, Matt, where they're so far behind the 8 ball in terms of getting another contract. Here, they've in many cases missed the opportunity for the January transfer window elsewhere because they're so late to the game. Their agents aren't out there putting their name out or putting their tape out or doing those things. It's not as simple as just going on, the soccer version of Indeed and looking for a guy, a company that's trying to hire a forward, right? Like there's a whole process of recruitment and placement that goes alongside this.
I don't know, Oliver, you can go to Brooklyn FC on Teamworks and apply for their head assistant coach right now. So where there's a will, there's a way.
All right. Well, I will say if Hartford Athletic ever posts that they're trying to get a defensive midfielder and I see that on Indeed, I will think that the club is maybe in trouble. And I know I talked about this on the November roundtable, so I don't want to reiterate the point too much, but there's something particularly grimy about the North Carolina situation because there's this teenager, Finn Sundstrom, right? He's, I think, just turned 19, and they gave him a professional contract this summer. And that's now barred him from competing at the college level, which I think I'm not suggesting that was his plan. I don't know if that would have been his goal otherwise, but they put him in this situation where they said, hey, we want you to be part of our organization. We want to pay you to do this. They persuaded him, however much persuasion it took, to sign that contract. And then just a few months later, they turned around and said, well, actually, we're not going to be here anymore. So good luck. Here's 2 months, whatever he's getting, however much he's getting paid out, and good luck with that. And maybe he's good enough that there's a line out the door and Louisville City is going to sign him. And in his specific case, it will work out. I don't know. But that's so grimy to approach that situation from my perspective with so little regard and for there to be so few guardrails. And it's totally understandable that the Players Association wants to put as much of a guardrail around that as they can if the league is not going to regulate that kind of coming and going of teams in a stronger way.
And to your point, Finn Sundstrom is probably going to find a long shelf life in the championship. As the club was folding, I had only heard of 3 players that had already secured a future, but those told me that those were already activities that were in flight long before the North Carolina announcement. And you're right, Finn may go out and do great things, but how many players are just average or are supplemental that are never going to see that opportunity again? In essence, their football careers could be over because they just missed the next wave and can't find that support mechanism into another club. They'd have to wait for the next transfer window into the summer or hope that a team is so injured that they can get scooped up on a 25-day contract. The idea of that, it's just unreal.
Exactly. And I think, looking to kind of the response and kind of uptick in, the USLPA's activism, it's kind of gone from just simple maybe social media posts to, I know they called for kind of fans to join them and kind of blocking the USL Championship accounts. Seemed like it really came to a head in, the USL Championship final where we had, I believe, all 22 players, walking out with the shirts talking about, that the USL wants pro rel. You should probably I'm paraphrasing, but you should try and get, pro standards first. So I think, Matt, just overall, how do you feel the USLPA has done in terms of maybe its activism and trying to gain attention for its cause? Because obviously, a lot of these fans are just, going to games wanting to, be able to enjoy the 90 minutes. But there's also these real kind of consequences and these real problems that the USLPA is trying to address. Just how do you think it's done in terms of trying to get its message and kind of, try and get fans behind them?
If you take away the soccer element of it for a second and you just look at this as union activity, I think they're operating from a pretty standard playbook. I've been impressed with some of their more grassroots guerrilla warfare campaigning where it's, blocking the league on social media to start hurting them in terms of, the growth numbers. It's now this shirt campaign. So far, the USLPA really hasn't punched back. Obviously, and we'll probably talk about this, I assume, in a minute, but, the end the end game for them, or the ace up their sleeve, is going to be a work stoppage. And that is never good for anyone. That's not good for the USLPA. That's not good for the league. That's not good for the fans. And again, if you take soccer out of this, I think I've been from a union working family. I am very familiar with those. I've been a part of unions myself. Unions are there to protect the players, but when the two entities can't come together, sometimes the story doesn't have a fairy book, a fairy tale ending. I think back to Hostess, the bakery company whose union famously went on strike until the company dissolved. They just said, hey, we're not going to get any better. They don't want to take care of us. We are just going to end this. And Hostess became nothing until their branding and stuff got reacquired at a later purchase. But the company as we knew it back in the early 2010s completely dissolved. And so for that to happen is going to be a dangerous thing. But as far as what the USLPA has done so far, I don't think they've probably done enough, which sounds insulting, but it's probably because they've wanted to hope that the USL headquarters would operate in some good faith, and that these were just warnings that we do have a bite, but here's our bark for the time being. I think that it's important to see that they are active, and now they are starting to leverage. They're coming to podcasts, they're coming to news agencies, they're having these discussions, and they're kind of being a little bit more candid about what's going on behind the scenes. They're no longer just saying, here are our 3 things that we'd like to see get across the finish line. They're being very truthful about where the problem lies. And unfortunately, right now, the entire problem is laid out at the feet of USL, and the USL are the ones that need to do the next step and respond not just to the CBA elements, but also the overall outlook about what's going on around the league. We talk about those T-shirts, but allegedly, as a ramification of that protest, the USL headquarters allegedly decided to take away Pittsburgh's ability to celebrate winning the championship. I don't know if that's true. I was of the opinion that they just ran out of broadcast time on big CBS because they went to extra time and then into penalties. But if that's true, you're already arguing in bad faith between two egos, one bruised and one desperate to try to have a decent conversation. That's not going to start a holistically positive or productive conversation if we're starting from, I'm going to literally take my ball and go home because I'm not happy with you. That is a bad place to have these conversations start to shift towards.
Yeah, and I think, kind of to a great point that you mentioned, Matt, and also everyone check out on Raising Anchor. They interviewed Connor Tobin, who works for the USLPA. Great interview, so make sure to check that out after this. But also, too, Oliver, would love to get your thoughts on, what was your reaction when you first kind of, saw this display during, a final game? And then also, too, like Matt said, it seemed like, they're allegedly, these USL championship players were punished. I believe there was also kind of rumors of, how they were able to celebrate and not looking like, the USL League One, even if you look at it from the off-camera perspective. Just overall, what's your reaction to kind of, the message that the USLPA put out, but also too, you kind of describe the griminess of kind of taking away a championship celebration from a club.
Yeah, I mean, when I saw the players walking out, I was like, oh, this is for real, right? Like, we're really taking this to another level, right? As Matt said, they had been pretty circumspect, right, in their public action and their public comment, and that's pretty typical from a bargaining perspective. You don't want to upset people by going out and in the media and making a lot of wild accusations, no matter how frustrated you are, as long as you feel like there is the possibility of that movement happening at the bargaining table. You want to try and keep everybody as happy as possible. And when you see these things start to happen like this, you had the statements of solidarity, I think, from the NFLPA and the MLSPA, and I think from the AFL-CIO and others. When you start to see those things happening, it's an indication that we're moving away from that. We're still in that hope that we're going to reach an amiable agreement, right? We're moving into a different stage of these negotiations. And that made me kind of bummed out, right, to see that, just because that's an indication that things are not headed in a positive direction. But I was also impressed with the kind of coordination and the solidarity and the discipline of the union, right? That's not a guarantee. There's lots of unions out there that are super disorganized and they couldn't get 22 guys to wear a shirt together, right? And they're much more well-funded and much more long-standing than the USLPA is. And some of this is, these guys have very close connections. They are teammates. They build relationships in a way that is different from some other organized labor environments. But it was both disappointing to see that we are at this juncture and impressive that there is this very coordinated campaign. It makes me feel good about where the USLPA is in terms of their capacity to pursue this negotiation to the best conclusion. On the flip side of that, if it is the case that the USL decided as a consequence of that action, we are going to not have this on-field trophy presentation and championship celebration, I believe that because it strikes me as kind of a piece with the USL's reaction to just about everything, which is that they haven't thought about it, right? If you are in a labor negotiation, somebody should be saying, this isn't going well. What are we going to do if the players do a protest at the championship game? That shouldn't be a surprise to anybody on the other side of the bargaining table. If you've ever been in any kind of labor negotiation, you have to be thinking about these. You have to be thinking about what happens if we wake up tomorrow and they're picketing outside, or we wake up tomorrow and they've decided to put up a big Scabby the Rat, or whatever it is, right? And it felt like in so many other things, the USL simply wasn't prepared. And they did the first thing that came to mind and the first thing on the table, which was to pull the trophy presentation. Now, maybe they didn't. Maybe it was because CBS said, we don't have time for this. Maybe there was some other reason. Certainly, the USL has lost that battle, right? People think this is the reason for it, and so that's what has now resonated with people, whether it's true or not. But it feels like a reaction that is of a piece with the USL's general approach to everything on the footballing side of things. We talked about this with the alleged racism issue in Hartford this season. We've seen that with allegations of homophobia or other things at other clubs on the pitch. We see it every time a story comes about how the showers don't work at a particular club. The USL just doesn't have a reaction. There's no statement. There's nothing. They've got, I checked on their corporate website. They've got tons of time to talk about USL Space Coast or USL Green Bay or their newest corporate partner. And those things are important, right? I don't want them to not do those things. It is important to grow the league. It is important to grow those partnerships. They don't have time to talk about any of this other stuff because they don't have staff dedicated for it, right? They don't have people internally whose role it is to think about how we are going to respond to some kind of labor action. If there's a strike in January, what is the USL going to do? It's going to be like poor Nicholas Murray out there on Twitter and Blue Sky. I feel bad for the guy because he's the face of this, right? In a really meaningful way. That's the person everybody knows, and as far as I know, he has nothing to do with this.
Yeah. When you don't hear Murray respond when hundreds of fans are asking, can you at least relate what is going on within the USL headquarters? Is this true? Is this claim substantiated? And at best, you can't even get Murray to say no comment at this time. Then it adds fuel to the fire. Because if this is truly a just gross misunderstanding, the league could easily get in front of this and say, no, we just ran out of airtime. It was costing us thousands of dollars a minute to go over, and we just had to make the decision. We apologize. It wasn't the best decision, but it had nothing to do with this. Instead, left in silence, we all know this story. The people will start assuming the worst. And in this case, if there's truth to that, if there's smoke, then there's fire, and this is not a fire that we want inside our house.
Yeah, and I'm not in the business of arguing on behalf of billionaires, but so I'll pass it on to you, Matt. Why have we gone to this point where there hasn't been a deal made, there haven't been discussions made? Again, the USLPA is asking for a very simple ask. Just why has the USL just essentially not come to the table? What is there to gain from not even kind of trying to entertain these basic thoughts? Just try and bring us into the mind of, the USL side of this, into why we've reached this point.
So I promise I also will not be a homer for the USL, but this all comes down to one issue at the end of the day that is preventing us from seeing progress for a CBA to be successfully navigated here into 2026. And it's all because of the elephant in the room, and it's the announcement of Division 1 and Pro Rel earlier this season. Now, going back in the timeline for a second, I truly believe that this was probably a lack of foresight from the league when they got really excited in announcing that they had finally gotten the votes. Because remember, Pro Rel had been something they had been trying to get internally across the finish line from the leadership and the owner groups for 2 years. I think the first discussion had happened in 2023 in Colorado Springs. Then they had ongoing discussions in 2024. And then finally they get this announcement. They get what they're looking for from the ownership group, a majority, a super majority, if you will, that's going to say we want promotion and relegation, and in tandem, we're also going to have Division One. I think maybe they had the announcements in the reverse order there, but nevertheless, they were so excited that they had gotten these two pieces of their product that they had been fighting for internally for so long that nobody stopped and checked and said, okay, as we announce these things, what are the ramifications of that to our current football ecosystem? And that was where that probably was a big miss. The league has to take an L on this, knowing that they were currently already under CBA negotiations for the very year that they announced this in. So whether or not that was calculated or whether that was a miss, that is the single reason. I don't care what anyone else says. If you have any insider conversations with either the league or the USLPA, that is the crux of the matter. And it's not because the league is this evil henchman who's like, we won't pay anyone another dime because we want to hoard all of our money for forever and we don't care about professional standards. The problem is they've literally put the cart in front of the horse on this. Now with this commitment to ProRel and Division One, with the USLPA, remember this first CBA was in effect in 2021 with its expiration in 2025. So at a minimum, they're going to want at least a 3 to 5 year collective bargaining agreement. They probably would want more if that benefits the fact that the players will be even more protected down the road, but they don't want to have to continue to come back to the table over and over if their standards can be met or they can find a compromise. So now you have this CBA needing to go into, in effect, this ProRel Division One uncharted territory. Now, why that's the matter at hand is we know there's a USL 1 CBA that's set to expire after the championship. We know that they're in the process of negotiating a super CBA for the USL Super League for the women's side. So we probably could assume that unless they integrate all of the CBAs into one football, pyramid CBA, I can't say super, I guess we'll call it the premier CBA, that there will eventually be a D1 CBA. And the problem is cart in front of the horse. You can't build a premier CBA until there's players in it to represent their interests and what they would want. That's not how it works. So for now, the championship CBA is the one that has to carry the water as they navigate into what does Division One standards look like? What does Division One compensation look like in comparison to championship, in comparison to USL 1? What do the professional standards look like? What do incentives look like? What do guarantees look like? And the problem is, Sam, is that the USL doesn't know. Because they announced this thing that they finally got permission to go talk about and do, and they gave themselves a 3-year roadmap to build the strategy. And that is a great amount of time to build and figure out how you're going to successfully launch both a Division One league and a ProRel accompanied, mechanism. But they can't do that now. They can't make promises and commitments to USLPA that says we will have this, 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 and this, because they just don't know. So because they have nothing to bring to the table, and USLPA rightfully is, crossing their arms and saying, we're not moving on this until you tell us the truth about this, because why would we lock ourselves into a bad deal? Progress can't be made. And that's the truth of it. So it's not, there's no boogeyman here. There's no bad guy who wants to screw someone over. It's the fact that the league jumped the gun. The USLPA is right to stand fast on what they need to do to protect their players, and there's no compromise in the middle because there's nothing to offer. That being said, if you think about it, I don't know if now the USLPA needs to think of a shortened CBA to protect through this corridor until we get to that and then go back to this drawing board all over again, or if the league has to start making some commitments that they're going to be locked into around parts of the strategy that they just don't know yet. And remember, too, the other thing that's breaking down these conversations, it's not like MLS or NFL talking with the union representation. It is 56 club owners talking with the USL headquarters, then talking with the representatives from the USLPA. There's a lot of people that you have to have in a majority to have these conversations and get approvals. I bet you it's a lot easier in the MLS to make a decision than it is with 30 club owners, 10 to 15 USLPA representatives, and then 10 to 15 league officials. That's too many cooks in the kitchen. And so even if there were progress to be seen, it's probably convoluted by the fact that there's just so much chaos going on with this. I'll say one last thing. As painful as this is, I'm at least glad this is what's happening, because could you imagine if they had actually had the foresight to know that the CBA needed to be handled, negotiated in bad faith, locked them into parameters, and then announced Division One and Pro Rel next year right before World Cup, and then just forced them into just, again, a bad deal. Like, this is a good thing it's happening, but I wish the league had some better clarity as they announced it on what they would already need to commit for the USLPA to do their job to the best of their abilities.
Yeah, I mean, this is like, again, it's back to there's no plan, right? And this is true. This is what I was hearing when the Pro Rel announcement came out from people at clubs was, yeah, they say these things all the time, and then there's nothing. And then there'll be radio silence for months or years while nothing happens, because they had this announcement and there was nothing backing it up other than we finally got, to your point, Matt, this number of people, 30 owners or whatever it is to agree, 24 owners to agree to something. And so we saw this a few years ago with the initial announcement for the W League. It was they ran out there and they had 6 clubs, and I think only like 3 of those clubs actually ended up playing in the W League. And one of them was supposed to be Hartford, and Hartford didn't, pursue that at that time. And so there was no there. There was just this idea that we're going to have this amateur women's league and we'll figure out the details later. And on the one hand, there's something like very American about that. And I say that and I say that as a person who values that, right? I don't mean that pejoratively in any sense, but we've got an idea and we're just going to figure it out as we're going along. We're not going to do this in a way that is like we figured out every step of our 74-point plan to implement Pro Rel before we told anybody about it. It's, hey guys, I've got a cool idea. Let's do Pro Rel, and we'll do it in 3 years. We'll figure it out along the way. And that's fine. Right? To your earlier point, Matt, like, that's fine. We've got some time. But now you've said that, and now you've got to bring all these people into that conversation. You've got to make sure that the owners are happy. You've got to make sure the players are happy. You've got a lot of fans who have a lot of strong feelings about what Pro Rel or D1 means, and you got to give them something that's going to keep them happy. You have corporate partners, you have media partners, and I mean CBS, right? I don't mean the Blazing Musket, right? That you've got to keep happy, right? Sorry, Sam. You've got to do all of these things, right? And because you did this in the very kind of cart before the horse way, the let's just have a great idea, none of those people are on board. And that doesn't mean they can't get on board. The players are super excited. When you hear what the players think about Pro Rel, there's not like a super majority of players saying we think this is a terrible idea, right? They're excited to participate in the system that is the case basically everywhere else in the world that has soccer, right? They can be brought along to that, but now you have to make them happy. Now you have to give them what they're going to want as a piece of that puzzle. If you're talking about D1 sanctioning and you're going to make people build 15,000-seat stadiums and you're going to try and hit up CBS for $1 billion TV deal or whatever it would be, it wouldn't be $1 billion, but whatever it would be, they're going to want a piece of that. There's no revenue sharing in USL, right? Not to that extent. There's a little bit with the media deal, but there's not this infrastructure, right, of revenue sharing that we see with other leagues, right? There's none of those pieces where you could just say to the players, you'll split 30% of the CBS deal, right, as a pot or something like that. That's not there. There's no solidarity payments for clubs that are going to be dropping down the table, and right, none of those things exist, and they can exist in the future, but they have to do these all at the same time now, alongside renegotiating the CBA, which the players already came into the negotiations with real concerns and objectives, right? A lot of these things they're asking for, they would have been asking for anyway, but now there's this other piece of the puzzle, right? They didn't just want more money because of D1; they want more money because the players need to eat. Right? The players need to be able to pay rent. They need to be able to buy health insurance for their families. But now those things all exist alongside. Oh, there's going to be D1. Oh, there's going to be Pro Rel. Whatever else it's going to be.
Yeah, and I think, you can't escape the Pro Rel conversation when it comes to this, because I think, obviously it's a major factor into negotiations and just the moment that we're in. Obviously, I think there would be a major impact if the USL, has announced that it's, going to implement Pro Rel, going to have this Division 1 league, and then basically that same season when it's announced, there's a work stoppage. So, I mean, I'd love to get your guys' thoughts on, as we're closing in, what do you think, what do you expect is the outcome that we get come the deadline? And then what do you think, how would a potential lockout impact, the discussion and kind of aims and aspirations of bringing pro rel to the United States?
Yeah, so the current CBA provides that the term of the contract is through December 31st, 2025. But it also provides that the contract can continue beyond that, right? It's not that we get to January 1, 2026, and there's no deal anymore and there's no work. Now, either side, the players or the league, could initiate a work stoppage. The players could go on strike, or the league, the owners, could have a lockout. That could very well happen at 12:01 a.m. on January 1st. And Matt, I think you're probably better positioned to speak to what the likelihood of that is at the moment. But that is not a guarantee. They could play in 2026 without a contract. They could play in 2027 without a contract. If you've worked in a labor environment, if you've worked in a union environment, you know that sometimes there's a long period of time where the workers are working without a contract, and then the contract is agreed, and there'll be some kind of retroactive provisions, right, for that period without the contract, whatever those might be. So I don't think there's not this looming crisis. And I think that's the way it's been sold on social media, not by the USLPA necessarily, but by people who have not maybe read the CBA or don't really understand union environment or labor negotiations. It's been sold as if there's no agreement by December 31st, there will be no league, right, going forward. That could be the case, but it's not necessarily the case. And so I think it's important to kind of like set that context a little bit before we talk about what's likely.
Yeah, Oliver's 100% right. So from what I've heard from both the league and the USLPA is that while they are not shying away from that inevitable marching order, they also, neither one of these entities wants this to happen, because this could have ramifications on not just the growth of USL, but this could put the league on life support. Whether, you think about the immediate implications of a work stoppage, but then there's long-lasting impacts to that in a sport where this is not baseball, where it's a one horse show. This is a soccer environment that's globally played. Players interested in this league that have a choice between this league or another league, but found out that the league's gone through union strikes, people didn't get their benefits, their salary increases. Right now, if you think about like the South America game, we often see so many players come for sometimes smaller contracts because of guaranteed clauses of pay, of benefits, of housing, and they're willing to take a chance because of inconsistencies down south. So, right now, everyone needs to avoid that. From what I've heard, is that everyone will report in for medical, everyone will report in for their preseason as normal, and then both the league and the USLPA will assess from there and make decisions, like Oliver said, whether it's a lockout from the league side or it's a work stoppage from the USLPA side of things. But kind of what I'm hearing between the lines anecdotally is, again, going back to what's kind of seen this stop or this lack of progress in the CBA discussions now because of this pro-rel format, is I think that what that tells me is that there's really not a conversation happening of any consequence or of any benefit to either party today. So I think that if the league can reorganize and if the USLPA can remain strong, because let's not pretend that the USLPA has an incredibly deep war chest to go the distance for a work stoppage of any kind. They could probably last, you're counting low double digits in terms of the amount of time that they could support players at any kind of level. I really think that this comes down to the January-February window of are the tables being set, and are both entities coming with actual conversation and progression. I think that at that point, if there's an honest conversation, I think we could see the players playing relatively deep into the 2026 season without a contract, and then having those conditions retroed as things get better. Because again, it's not about whether or not the league and the teams are willing to come to the table for minimum salary increases or health benefits. They've had these conversations before the CBA. There's progress that's been made there. It's the fact that they don't know how to carry that into the pro-rel that's paused it all. So I think that if people are willing to talk, I don't see the USLPA needing to go to the work stoppage. But that being said, if conversations break down, then if we do see a work stoppage, that's what happened, is that the USL failed to want to continue their dialogue, and they'd rather strong arm and go through some sort of secondary mechanic, whether it's scabs, it's resetting and blowing up the USLPA and thinking that they can survive that, which between us three and all the listeners, I don't think the league could survive a work stoppage or a lockout at this critical juncture, even with the World Cup amplifying the awareness and the desire to consume soccer products here in our country.
Yeah, I totally agree with your perspective there, Matt. I think my take is that the work stoppage would be more likely to come from the league side. I don't think it's likely that the players would strike, given some of the limitations that they face. Right? They, as you rightly point out, there aren't a lot of resources to continue a strike for a very long period of time. And I will say, one of the challenges with sports strikes is, for the most part, they'd much rather be playing. Right. And I don't want to suggest that there are not other labor environments where people really love their jobs, but it is, in some ways, it does feel a little different when you talk, especially at this level. We're not talking about huge, life-changing amounts of money in general, right? We're not talking about millions of dollar contracts. They'd much rather be playing, and there aren't the resources on the USLPA side to support that for very long. But the USL, the league's kind of reactiveness and lack of control and lack of forethought does worry me a little bit when it comes to, the feeling that if somebody wakes up on the wrong side of the bed, or someone doesn't like the way Connor Tobin talks about the USL on a podcast at some point, that then we get a lockout because there isn't this thoughtfulness of their approach. And I don't trust the league to get this right. I have a lot of confidence in how the players have conducted themselves, and their interests are pretty easy to define. It's not clear as much if the league ultimately thinks that they can get better real estate deals with a lockout, and they can grow the league in that way. Whether they're right or wrong, they might take an action that is detrimental to the USL in its current format. But I think they're going to be wrong if they think there's a benefit to a work stoppage. I don't think that's going to be the case, especially next summer.
Yeah. And if that championship celebration hadn't happened, I would have been a lot more confident. Now seeing that and seeing some of the rash decisions, again, allegedly, if true, if that's the case, like, who are the people making these decisions? We know the leadership at USL. Is it, what are the owners' stake in this? Like, what are they saying back to USL? Because they don't want their investment, where they're already losing millions of dollars, to continue to lose even more millions of dollars as they try to suffer through these stoppages. I mean, could you imagine a team that's losing $1 to $3 million in operating costs now not getting their additional $500,000 to $2.6 million in turnstile revenue? Like, there could be teams that just don't survive this. There are not strong ownerships in some of the older legacy teams that we've seen fall off. I mean, like Miami FC, yeah, they could probably weather it because they like losing money. But a team that, let's go Tulsa. Tulsa just had an incredible year, but I don't think they could afford that from their ownership group. I don't think they have that kind of deep pocket. So the USL HQ and all of their expansion fees, yeah, they could survive. They could batten down the hatches and survive any kind of storm and reset and rebuild. But these ownerships and these fan bases, these communities would be just completely devastated if this were to be something that happened.
Yeah, and I think, like you guys said, there isn't necessarily this looming deadline. Obviously you can kind of go into the season maybe without kind of having this labor dispute resolved, but obviously I think there's, like it's been mentioned, you have Pro Rel, you have the World Cup, and I think it's also worth mentioning, this podcast maybe is not the biggest fan of MLS, but when it comes to MLS and their recent change of the calendar, that's really trying to establish itself as one of the top leagues, continue to grow its standing within other leagues, and both leagues probably won't ever say this publicly that they're competing against each other, and it's probably more of a fan-driven thing, to be honest. But when you have this prolonged labor dispute in the backdrop of kind of soccer having the potential to really grow out of the World Cup, when you have a league like MLS changing its schedule and looking to grow its stature, just how does that affect, the outlook? And, the optics are essentially everything. How does that affect the optics of a league like USL as it attempts to, again, it probably will never admit that it's trying to compete, and it might not actually be trying to compete with MLS, but kind of compete for the eyeballs of the American soccer fan?
I think MLS, I don't want to say MLS is competing with USL, but MLS is certainly paying attention. They don't make decisions with USL top of mind, but they absolutely have gamed all of these things out, right? Whatever MLS is they have thought about the long-term growth strategy, which is oftentimes one of the things that fans hate about MLS. It feels inorganic. It feels corporate. It feels like they've got a 10-year strategic plan in a drawer somewhere. And you have to have those things, right? That's so much of what USL is lacking. MLS has that. They have absolutely thought about, even if USL hasn't, they have thought about what happens if there's a USL work stoppage. And maybe that goes as far as like which players are clubs interested in if there's a work stoppage, if there's guys who are out of contract, for example, or are unable to play. Maybe it doesn't go that far. I don't know. But MLS is thinking about those terms. It's why they're willing to put MLSNP teams in places like Bridgeport, Connecticut, right? That have never been ever able to support professional supports. As much as I would love it if they could, it has never been the case. But MLS is willing to countenance that. And that's not just because they love the idea of soccer in Bridgeport, Connecticut, right? They are absolutely thinking about a bigger picture here. And that includes competing with USL and competing with Hartford Athletic and competing with Rhode Island FC, right? In one form or another. So MLS is thinking about this. And USL has to think about that. This is not the kiddie pool, right? This is the deep end of the pool, or if you want to, the lake or the river or the ocean with the sharks. They are there, and they have lots of money, and if they even think for a moment that USL is a serious competitor, they will pull out all of the stops to crush the league. And USL cannot give them that kind of ammunition.
When you look at the World Cup cycle, it's numbers that I'm really into this part of the statistical data when you look back as far as 1994 and every cycle, and then even the cycle where the U.S. men's national team did not qualify, and then also specifically to the U.S. women's national team. These two numbers are pretty consistent, but you have anywhere between a 17 to 31% increase in soccer viewership, not just in the tournament, but in that kind of carryover between years. The fallout rate is somewhere on average about 8%. So you could say 12 to 20% carryover year over year, or at least cycle after cycle. And then in the international game alone over the last decade, there's been a 60% increase in viewership for the international game, according to Nielsen ratings. So like when you look at the impact of what this will have, the USL can't, I mean, I don't know what the market share is. I wish I knew this off the top of my head, but whether the MLS has 95% of the domestic soccer pie or they have 70%, the fact of the matter is that 8 to 12 to as much as 31% increase, the USL cannot afford to miss this cycle. And keep in mind, those numbers are averaged from 1994 all the way until now, where we haven't seen a World Cup back in North America since. So the explosion, the way media product is consumed in comparison to television back in the day, the overall mechanics of how people kind of like invest in soccer as like more than just a game, we could see explosion of growth that will never be replicated in our lifetimes. And so the USL almost is kind of backed against a wall that they can't afford to let this slip through their fingers. And this would be the biggest mistake of the Papadakis line and their ownership strategy to let a work stoppage happen. Because remember, too, in solidarity, even though they're different CBAs, if USL Championship goes down, USL 1's not playing. USL Super probably won't play because they're trying to ratify a CBA. I don't know how USL 2 would work out, because I think given the proximity of like the semi-professional game, I'm sure they would try to do it in solidarity, but those are college players trying to get their next step. So I could see them distancing themselves. So from the World Cup cycle alone, Sam, that's the huge part. And then when you talk about the schedule too, there's going to be a 2-month concentration where it's Major League Baseball, USL, and I apologize for any offshoot of like a racing sport that I'm not following, but like in terms of the big 5 of types of sport, that's not nothing. And so the USL is going to have to get that right. And again, this will be an example, because from what we've heard, championship will not stop play. I don't think that they may slow down, but one, there's not really many players impacted by the international game at the USL level. 2, the schedule condensing just doesn't make sense to take that long of a break. They may take an extended period either at the very beginning or at the very end, or scatter games, but there definitely will probably be championship games played through the World Cup. So it's not it's not a great look for them to even think about staggering or stifling their growth. And it's not a good look that if they decide to start doing a lockout or a stoppage, if I'm Connor Tobin, I may be targeting the World Cup because everyone's typing soccer into their Google search every day. And then every day they see American League shut out in the middle of World Cup. Is soccer to blame for the demise of growth? I don't know. But like, I could easily see if you were going to tactically target, that's where I would go after. That's where I would hit USL. Where it hurts the most is right in the middle of that World Cup cycle.
Yeah, I mean, and the Players Association has been so disciplined through all of this that I think my assumption would be that they would have their strategy worked out. They have their strategy worked out now, even if they're not sharing it, right? They know what they want to do if we get to June, July, and that we're not seeing the kind of movement that makes it feel like an agreement is on the horizon. If an agreement isn't reached before then, and again, like back to the point, it just doesn't feel like the the league is even playing in those same waters. And I will say, like, hiring Tony Scholes from the Premier League, whether that works or not, that's intended to be part of the solution, right? Bringing in somebody who knows how this works is intended to be part of the solution. And maybe he's not the right guy. Maybe he doesn't have the right skill set. Maybe knowing how the Premier League works doesn't translate to the American soccer ecosystem, which is incredibly chaotic and very different. But that's a big step, right, to bring in someone with that level of expertise. It's not something that the USL has really had before. And so maybe that is a piece that shuffles this around a little bit in the next 3 or 4 months. Maybe it isn't, but it's clearly intended to help raise the capacity of the league.
You mean your uncle is not going to get an exclusive interview with you and you're going to find out all the details about what he's going to offer here in the USL?
Well, as I said, the family doesn't celebrate Thanksgiving, so I won't have the opportunity to bring it up.
Yeah, and I do have to say, as stepping into Thomas Pinzone's shoes, I do have to say, Matt, that's prime NASCAR season. That's prime. There's F1 American races there.
F1's always on. I feel like anytime I want to watch racing, Grand Prix, F1, any type of Indy stock car, like I can get that type of racing at any time of the year. Like it is just perpetually on in a different continent at a different time every single day. I always can find racing when it comes to that.
But had to get that out. But this has really been a fascinating discussion. Definitely learned a lot about how we got here, and hope all the listeners enjoyed the convo too. But just want to give you guys some time to shout out what you've been working on recently and where people can find you. Well, you can find me, Sam Lattof, at the Blazing Musket, and I'll take this opportunity and then I'll throw it to someone like a seasoned podcast host like Matt Entriken. And I'll just say, really appreciated the support that this podcast has gotten. I've always been someone where I've been like, I am way too busy to try and host a podcast. Covering the Revs and covering Vermont Green. So really appreciate Thomas Pinzone for stepping in. He's done a great job. Also, we got some fantastic guests like Matt, Oliver, Sean, Mike, and, all the guys and gals who work at the Blazing Musket. So want to give all those people a shout out and really appreciative of, anyone who, puts in work here at the Blazing Musket. But so make sure to check us out. Might have some new things on the horizon, some updates and upgrades, if you will. So stay tuned for that. But I'll hand it over to Matt Entriken. Where can people find you, and what have you been up to recently?
That's how you do it, bud. You never want to talk over somebody when you can avoid it. So, the show is surprisingly, I just did the count. We're almost at 200 episodes, 3 seasons in. So it's insane to know how much life we've dedicated to a USL Championship Soccer Club. Right now, we're technically in the off season. We have just one show left to kind of do a player rating review and evaluation. And then we kind of go dark for a bit. We still will have a scattered amount of interviews. So we will have our exit or end of year postmortem with head coach and general manager Conno Smith, as we'll reflect on the season and get kind of what his, top of Centerville Bank Stadium bird's eye look will be on the season at large. And then in 2026, we'll be coming back in a new format. We've been teasing it for a few weeks, but we're going to be kind of going into a radio show programming. Not ready to put all of the the secrets and the details out there, but we'll be changing up the format to go into that kind of broadcast structure. Super excited about those things that are coming on the horizon. And yeah, I'm just going to enjoy some time between Thanksgiving and, preseason check-ins, and just be covering the schedule release, the players that are leaving us, the players that will be joining us, and trying to get some rest in between. But it's been a great run, and we love everything we get to do at these shows. The Blazing I can't even give you guys the right props because I can't say your name correctly when I go, but the Blazing Musket is just such a superior, just focal point of soccer coverage. Every time I talk to new people around the league and I tell them kind of the association that we have, they always know exactly everyone and the contributors and the amazing writing staff of the entirety that makes up this organization. So, Sam, I would be remiss if I didn't tip my hat to you and say looking back on what a great partnership and what a great relationship it's been in this second year for us. So thanks for everything you do, buddy.
All right, I guess that's Sam pointing to me now, so I'll pop in. Yeah, I will say it's been great. I've never really been a go on podcasts guy ever until this summer when Sam desperately needed someone to talk about. I think it was when Mamadou Dieng got sold, and he desperately needed somebody who knew what was going on with Mamadou Dieng to talk about it. So I came on to do that. So it's been really great, and I've enjoyed it, and I hope to continue doing it. I have a piece that's just gone up on the Musket about kind of looking back to some preseason predictions about Hartford Athletic and what I got kind of right and what I got really wrong, and a few more things coming, kind of closing out the season, and then looking very much at what's happening with Hartford's offseason, who's coming, who's going, what's happening again with the schedule, hopefully not quite as catastrophic as last year when it was no fun, but it'll be fun to write about, I guess. So
Oliver, do you want to tease someone that's leaving Hartford or joining Hartford, and I'll do the same for Rhode Island?
You go first. Yeah.
Oliver, you did just write about this, so it's not even like you're breaking anything. You actually did just write about this today. So just want to give that preface. But Matt, who is leaving Rhode Island FC? Confirmed 100%. Bet your mortgage on it. Clearly this is not anything that Matt will put kind of a qualifier on.
Oh, no, this is 100% confirmed, and I don't care if I get in trouble for it. Jackson Lee will not be returning as one of our goalkeepers in the goalkeeping union or core for 2026. So you're hearing it here first. Jackson Lee is no longer a Rhode Island FC player, and he will be testing his mettle elsewhere, whether that's in the championship or somewhere else in 2026. So best of luck to Jackson. He was a fan favorite. We love him so much, and we can't wait to see what great things are ahead for him.
So the one that I teased heavily today is that Anthony Siaha has been training with New York Red Bull down at their training facility, and it seems highly likely that he is going to be moving to the MLS club once his contract officially expires. Well, not officially. Once the league year officially ends at the end of this month, that will probably be announced, if not soon.
Sam, when does this go out so I know when I get in trouble with Rhode Island FC communication stuff?
Buddy, I'm clipping it. It might come out. We're recording at 8:45 p.m. on November 25th. It might be out by 9:30, 10 o'clock p.m. So really appreciate it. That will be a Matt Entriken big time and Matty Enks exclusive. But no, I appreciate it, guys. I appreciate guys, and I will never stop saying that I appreciate the both of you. And I also will never stop saying appreciate the listeners. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Blazing Musket podcast. I also want to give a quick shout out to Steve Stower, the actual founder of the Bent Musket and the Blazing Musket. He's an avid listener, and so I will give him a shout out. But really appreciate everyone. Hope you are all doing well. Hope you have a good holiday weekend, and goodbye.
Bye.